back to Chasing Squirrels podcast. This morning I'm talking with Jonathon Reed. Jonathon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Do you, I mentioned on the on-ramp that I was going to ask you to throw down your own intro. Are you still cool with throwing something down onto tape?
Yeah, sure. My name is Jonathon Reed. My pronouns are he and him, and I, kind of in one sentence, I'm a boys program facilitator. I work a lot on boyhood masculinities, both at summer camp and school-based programs. I create a podcast called Breaking the Boy Code, which we might talk about more, and I'm on the National Youth Working Group on Gender Equality. So, yeah, huge passion for working on gender with boys and young men. Is that too quick, or is that that do the trick?
No, that was perfect. It was within your intro as well that I sort of got to know you. I was fortunate enough to come to, I guess, in my mind, I kept on calling it a conference. I called it a one-day conference back in March with Next Gen Men, and you were one of the facilitators there. And I can remember at the time, it was funny. At the time I'm sitting there, like, I know this guy from somewhere. I'm listening. I'm watching you present. I'm sort of listening. Where do I know this guy from? And it was funny because it just brings to mind, like, I like all the different places that you exist in because, getting that in real life connection can sometimes be a little bit like it's kaleidoscopic. You just don't, you have, you follow someone, let's say on Insta, or you follow someone on Twitter, or in your particular case, your voice I knew from your podcast, but it was disembodied. I didn't have a person to connect with it. And at that point, I hadn't sort of chased or lurked any feeds to say, like, what does this person look like? Like, I only had the voice. So I'm sitting there and I'm like, yeah, this information, it's, you're talking about, shifting the language from toxic masculinity to precarious masculinity. And I'm like, I think I've heard that somewhere before. And it was kind of mind blowing. And I think it was only afterwards that Jake, it's Sitka? Yeah. Stika. How do you say Jake's last name?
Stika.
So he, I was just talking, he said to me, he's like, oh, somehow it came up about podcasting. He's like, oh, by the way, Jonathon does a podcast. I'm like, that's the thing. There's the connection. And I think at that time, I was kind of, I wonder, it's not that I'm constantly sussing out, specifics. Like I don't go thinking to myself, I need to talk to a certain type of person on the podcast. Like I don't think of certain conversations necessarily being missing from my episode list. But I am always sort of thinking, and like I told you in the on-ramp, what's another conversation that would be cool to have? And when I heard that you were a podcaster, I almost felt like, oh, he gets it. He'll do this. He'll go for a conversation.
Yeah.
So thank you for coming to the podcast. I'm really appreciative that we could sort of dance with this and make it happen. And also, jumping in on this on a Sunday morning is, I've had just enough coffee to kind of get the ideas rolling, right? Okay, so I don't know exactly where to start, but I kind of want to start with a concept that was raised at the Next Gen Men that I think was still, it was a little bit of a gray zone for me. And it was in the Next Gen Men training that we had, we did an activity where we unpacked, dissected, kind of pulled apart the man box.
Yeah.
I want to lay against that, or lay beside that, some of the work that you're doing with Boy Code. So on one hand, we have Boy Code, and on the other hand, we have Man Box. And my brain, because I work in a high school context, I'm watching kind of developmental transitions at the same time that I'm looking at academic, social, cultural transitions, like the sort of that step of coming from grade 7 and 8 into grade 9, and then grade 9 into 10, 10 to 11, 11 to 12, 12 on. And I've become kind of fascinated with the nuances between Boy Code and Man Box and whether or not that's one operating system as a whole,
Hmm.
or if there's actually some space between the two where we can kind of, there's a good spot there to do some interruption. And I'm curious from your perspective, if you see them as separate pieces, does one kind of wrap around the other? Is it a progressive? Is it like a progression uh, of
Hmm.
um, of way of being, way of thinking? So yeah, I don't know. That's the cloud. Can we start with that cloud on
Yeah.
the front end?
Yeah, that's super interesting. I'd never really thought about that.
What do you think of that?
Um, Yeah, it's sort of, I mean, so first of all, like the man box um is sort of an image or a visual that's often used in programming with boys and men that sort of gets at, okay, inside this box, this is what you're allowed, and then outside the box, that's the stuff that, so inside would be, being strong and being tough and being dominant, and outside would be like emotional expression, being weak, wearing feminine stuff. Like, so it's this sort of, dichotomy of what's allowed and what's not for boys and men. The boy code, I'm trying to remember where I originally came across that term. I think it was um, Dan Kinlan and Michael Thompson. I think it was a book called Raising Cain, but that's sort of a guess. Like it's sort of in the fog of memory. Um, but what I'd say, like, because they're not, first of all, at first glance, they're definitely not mutually exclusive, and there's a lot of overlap. But for me, perhaps what a difference or uh, a contrast between the two, or like what differentiates them for me, is that like for me, I guess the boy code feels a little more um, like it refers to the act of policing that line that is the man box. So the man box, like sometimes I don't always get to the point where I'm able to talk about what happens when you're at that line, and you're crossing that line between what's allowed and what's not. And for me, the boy code kind of engenders like a recognition of what actions and behaviors and violence lies at that line of what's allowed and what's not. So there's this code that says, you've got to be tough, you've got to be dominant, and here's what we're going to do if you're not. Um, and so, for example, like I'm not going to remember this super well, but there's a Bell Hooks quote where she says, like, the first act of violence that patriarchy, sorry, I'm not even sure if that's the right pronouns for Bell Hooks, but the first act of patriarchy that the first act of violence that patriarchy demands of men is not violence towards others, it's violence towards themselves, to mutilate or to cut off the parts of their emotional expression or their effeminate parts of their identity. And if they don't do it to themselves, it will be done to them. And I think that for me, like the boy code kind of feels like it's touching on it will be done to them, like that sort of act of policing that happens between boys. And maybe you're right that it is a progression from experiencing that code of behavior and norms towards your own identity being constrained inside this box. But I have never really thought about that, so I'm also curious if you if you have a thought as well.
Well, there was a quote that there was the three of you there. So there was yourself, Jake was there. I didn't write down the third person. What was the third
Hussein.
coordinator that was there that day? Do you remember?
Yeah, Hussein.
Hussein.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of you three threw down also. Um, Patriarchy benefits men as a whole, but crushes individuals.
Right.
And I like that stalled me. That really stalled me because I get the I when I think about the sort of the social tools that have convinced or made me, educated me, mentored me into being a man, I would have never necessarily looked at patriarchy as, at the same time that it builds me up as part of a whole, that it's also sort of pushing down elements of me. I didn't have that sense from the inside of being pressurized that way or compartmentalized.
Right.
I recently was in a conversation. I recently was in a conversation with on another guest, talking about my sense of feeling like quite free. Like I felt like I can move through spaces and be in spaces and do things and kind of be who I wanted to be without having a similar sense of some of the things that that he was throwing down, talking about some of the limiters that he felt within the exact same spaces.
Mm,
And we started talking about kind of like the rules of welcoming or being welcomed. And I didn't have a sense of any of the, my sense was that it was barrier free, or just, I didn't even think to question the barriers.
right.
So when I think one of the things that kind of sits in this question about boy code to man box comes down to, and I could be using, um, I could be using maybe too brutal of a language, but the idea of the interrupting the actual journey between those two things, because I think in my mind I've kept them separately. I've sort of somehow thought like one ascends to the other, or you arrive realizing that you're in the box, but you move through the operating system of the boy code.
Right.
It kind of remains a little bit more subtle until you can actually say, holy crap, like, yeah, I can see now these barriers. So that idea of patriarchy benefiting men at the same time was a bit of a mind blower, because what I observe in schools with the young men, the boys, the kids that are coming into high school, is this sense of, I observe a sense of ownership and agency that what that training at that session has brought to mind, that it might not be as stable as it seems.
Yeah, I mean, like boys and maybe like I don't know if this is a bit of a blanket statement. I don't know if I fully stand by, but like I'm thinking, I'm feeling, I'm like I guess I'm reflecting on the fact that boys, in my experience, have been way more articulate about how they are held back through norms of masculinity than men that I've talked to are. Like I don't know, it becomes hard to just differentiate between, am I this way because that's me, or am I this way because that's a pattern or a set of expectations that I've grown up through society. Like it's really hard to differentiate that kind of thing. But I recently had a conversation with a group of grade 7 boys that was like, okay, what do you really like? Like there's lots of stuff to like about being a boy. What do you love about being a boy? And it was stuff like physicality in sports, and not having to give birth, for example. And we said, well, okay, and there's lots that we wish we could change, maybe. And what are some of the things about being a boy that we wish we could change? And like those were really real. They said, well, they said there's a sense of like competition that leads to arguments that we really wish didn't happen. They said there's really high expectations for us, but at the same time, there's really low expectations, which was a really interesting conversation. And then a really big one was, they said emotional problems aren't taking that seriously. And, and so having that conversation about what norms are we experiencing right now as 11 and 12 year olds, you can really see where they're headed with that. But also like at that age, they're given the space and given the opportunity, like they're very interested in questioning those norms.
Yeah, I see. I see that. I see that. I work one of the one of my colleagues that I work with. He's one of our educational supports at the school. His name's Hani, and he's a key facilitator in a group that we have at my school called Boys to Men, and they do a little bit of sports, a little bit of socializing, a little bit of social justice. It's a lot of little pieces coming together. In some ways, it's elements of Next Gen Men manifest with kind of high engagement and accessibility for the high school. And he and I, in some of our talks, really struggle with the version that the kids present versus the version that's just under the surface.
Right.
And as you said, the emotional fabric of boys, and also their conflicts, and not just the ones that we see. Let's say the ones that are entirely kind of trying to grab power, but the ones that are more about understanding power and agency, like understanding the self, the ones that are just underneath that kind of thin veil of ice. And that's, one of the parts that fascinates me about these young men coming into high school is, what is it that they're looking to belong to?
Right.
And I haven't quite figured out a good way to draw that out. But my second thing then is, well, what is it that I just don't understand about, or what we don't, as let's say as educators? I can broaden it out. It's personally me, but if I were to share it, like what is it that we're just not really getting about, what boys want?
I think like it's that sense of belonging, like, um, I mean, it's crucial for any young person, it's crucial for any person, any young person, and for sure any boy. Um, I was just thinking about, I actually had talked about this in one of my podcast episodes. But a really quick story is this researcher Judy Chu, who is researching boys, sort of like boys' masculinity, boys' friendships. I think at age like 5, 6, 7, pretty young age. And one of the things that she was noticing was that they would play with sticks pretending that they were guns. Teachers really hated it because they're like, it's like emblematic of like boys' violence and like gun violence and all kinds of things like that. And she had a more neutral perspective. And then what she said she noticed was that really it wasn't so much about the guns as it was about having a visual signifier that we have something in common and that we have a shared experience and that we can belong together. And for her, like what she was saying, and I don't remember, word for word, but just that like that gunplay didn't represent violence as much as it represented, a shared sense of like belonging, or friendship. And so for me, that's like, okay, so that sticks and imagination at age 5. But like what elements of violence remain parts of how boys identify with each other as they become, 12, 13, 15, 16, 14, 15, like as they become teenagers, right? Like to what extent are, norms of language, or behavior or, uh, yeah, anything from like fights to misogyny, part of like how they're figuring out, do I belong to this group? And if I act in a particular way, can I get the feeling of friendship and connection that I really deeply desire? Like, are those things connected to violence? Maybe.
It brings to mind the whole marshmallow test. Do you know that, the marshmallow test?
I was just gonna, no, I do not. I don't think. Go for it.
So the whole, yeah, well, it's like, I think it was probably, I don't have the proper circa on it, but I'm going to say, let's drop it down into somewhere in this 1960s, maybe 1970s, could have been just before that. And the researchers were doing an experiment on self-regulation, and they would present within a controlled environment, a marshmallow to a kid and say, you can eat this marshmallow right now, but if you can wait, you can wait. You can YouTube this. Parents, teachers are still doing this experiment and posting videos to YouTube. But they say, if you can, hold off X amount of time, or sometimes the time wasn't even said, then you can have two. So you're welcome to eat this one right now. Go ahead. You can eat it right now, by all means. But if you can hold off for a little bit, I got to go do some work in the other room. I'll come back. And if you haven't consumed, that one marshmallow, then you can have two marshmallows. And then they would go and they would sort of film, the machinations and the anguish of the child sitting there looking at the marshmallow. And there's a whole lot of sort of strategies and activities that the kids would go through in order to maintain their composure. The self-talk and sort of like playing with it, rearranging it, putting it out of sight, turning their back to it, calling out for help, is the time up yet? Is the time up yet? So there was, in itself, the experiment could sort of be, you could kind of paint it out to a bunch of different corners of the room. The heart of the research was looking at self-regulation and where that could potentially lead to adult qualities. So they're projecting this forward. And, some people have looked back and said that, okay, in some instances, young children that were not able to exhibit self-control and just shoved the marshmallow in their face right away, or maybe shoved it in there and then blatantly lied about it afterwards. Yeah, I didn't eat it. Someone else must have eaten it. There were some cases where as adults, they had challenges with self-regulation, but some of the newer thinking about it is also to make a direct line between a child that can't, help themselves from eating a marshmallow and their success in life. It's not as a direct line. There's other factors that
Right.
impact and kind of pinball that kid in life. So I playing with sticks as a early totem, or um, what's the word, secret identity. Like, it allows you to sort of role play within a frame that other kids are playing, and like you said, it belonging, connection to the group. I get hung on the sort of the tipping point to where behaviors like that become part of the case management in, let's say, a threat assessment meeting, where we're saying, okay, so has the child exhibited behaviors that could be, considered the antecedent to a situation that we're now dealing with, let's say violence in high school to some degree. And I've sat in on those meetings and I think to myself, I get kind of frustrated by the reductive nature of it. We have to get to an answer. We have to sort of figure this thing out. But I also, in the reductive approach, I also think to myself, when are we going to take some time to think of the other sort of like holes in the story that were being filled by other factors?
Right.
And there, as an educator, I'm fully aware that I'm only with these students for a part of the day. There's a whole lot of other stuff going on. Um, so that sense of belonging and the boys wanting to bring parts of themselves to school, I wish I had a memory I could tap into myself. Like, I wish I could say, yeah, I always wish I could have been this at school. Like, I wish I could have done this thing at school. What are do you have any observations on that? Like, what some of these kids are saying? Yeah, I wish I could kind of do this thing at school. If I could bring and be this person at school, it could be activity based or just like culture based or something. Are these the bits that we're kind of missing out, or we just don't get to them
Mm.
within a school
Hmm.
context? What do you
Well,
think?
I mean, first I'm thinking, the one thing that I do want to acknowledge is that, like, I'm not against playing with sticks and pretending that they're guns, and
Me
because there
neither.
are,
Me
and
neither.
yeah, and there's this perception that when we're talking about, um, like with a critical lens about masculinity and gender, that we're going to slip towards, anti-boy sort of rhetoric, and so that's something I want to point out, and that. Yeah, and I wouldn't suggest that, that playing with something in one way as a tiny kid is going to necessarily result in something else um, when you're a teenager. But so it's like, yeah. So I'm trying to say that it's like, it's not anti-boy, but one thing I do want to point out is that there is something I read recently, about, again, about really young kids and their, sort of like hegemonic misogynistic language towards each other and towards the girl in their class, and they were, again, like 5 and 6 years old, and what, the researcher was noticing is that the teachers would, um, not write off their behavior, but they would say, like, they're just little boys, and it's a natural part of boys' development to be, to be experimenting with this kind of language, or to, they're just like, they're innocent kids, and it's not. So they would miss that sort of gendered lens and not engage the boys on questioning, those kinds of, behaviors and ways of talking about each other and about the girls in their class. And the article was saying, um, that it's a bit of a missed opportunity, and that if we, um, want to, like, I guess, like, improve boys' social outcomes, that it's worth facilitating their questioning and their exploration of those norms. I don't know if I explained that very well, but it's basically saying, like, yeah, let's not assume the worst, but let's also, like, not leave things unquestioned, I guess. Um, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it it makes me, so what I observe then is I sort of take that and I look at um, high school context, and at any given moment as you move through the halls, you're transitioning between classes. So I'll say, as the one of the adults in the building, the things that we witness and see as teachers when we move through the halls, they're like, there's besides the classroom that you're getting to, where you're working with a group of 30, whatever your classroom responsibilities are, and then you have your lesson that you have to get through, the things that you experience as you move through the halls between classes, there's more than one period of time needed to sort of mentor through those moments.
Right.
There's more conversation, there's more dense, rich conversation opportunity in 4 to 5 minutes of walking between classes than you can ever get to within a classroom.
Huh.
There's a year's worth of there's a year I won't say there's a semester's worth of conversations within, I would say, one day of transitions between teaching classes. And that's just, it's mind blowing to me. So when I think about one of the greatest challenges of providing mentorship to boys in school, one, maybe this is what we can lead to next, is decontextualizing the moments so that we can play with them in a brave, safe space. So that thing that happens in the hallway can become a reflective practice away from the hallway. The second layer to this that, again, just messes with me, I've been doing a lot of thinking, personal thinking in my practice around what it is I see when I walk the halls. Where am I in the hall when I see it? What time is it? Like, I'm starting to look at some sort of deeper patterning as it just happens to happen in front of me. And in doing so, I'm starting to see a little bit more of my part in either promoting or demoting or dealing with those things. So, for example, walking around a certain corner at the school at some time of the day, what is my mindset as I'm turning that corner? Am I expecting to see something that is just going to, slow me down, or I'm going to have to deal with? Am I walking with an open mindset? What's my emotional state? And I've had these conversations with teachers, and they're thinking about these things, but we haven't had a really good time to really unpack and say, how does my positioning within these activities either change, increase the likelihood by not being able to address it? How does that help it, hurt it? So, big long ramble, jump on any of what you want in there. At the end, I'd like to talk a little bit about bringing I can say hallways, you can think of other spaces, I'm sure. How do we bring those moments in the hallway into a space where we can really kind of honor the conversation, dignify the individual, and really get into it where you feel like you can get a hold on it? It's not as much having a hold on you.
Right. Well, one thing, this kind of goes back to the like sort of two things ago, but you did sort of put something in my mind about like, oh, so what are boys missing? Like, what do boys want? And that's obviously like a super vague question. And it's again, in context dependent. But one thing that I'd say that, like, at least that it made me think of was that when I do evaluation of the programs that I do with Next Gen Men about, and what that looks like is about 3 months of after school programs that create the safe space and explore these different tenets of masculinity and pieces of masculinity and becoming young men, um, along with experiential activities and then like snacks and free time and that kind of thing. And often what they say their favorite part is, it's like it's not really the fun. It's like not really the free time. It's not playing sports together. It's not even always the experiential activities. Like what comes up again and again is like having somewhere that they could speak honestly and openly with their friends, and deepen their relationships and be vulnerable with each other. And um, so it's kind of funny because we set up this program, with different things and intentions about how to engage with them and to, and to have that sense of fun and have that sense of purpose. But what they really, and this isn't everybody, but what has come up multiple times again and again is that like what really stands out and what really mattered was that they could be together and they could be vulnerable. And so when I'm thinking about, yeah, what you're talking about in terms of like hallway moments and like and dignifying that time and that kind of thing is like, this might not be, I don't know, I'm a relatively young educator, right? But what I'm thinking about is that every adult who works with young people has the ability to create something, whether that's an individual one-on-one relationship or their entire classroom, sense of space and community, or whether it's an after-school program or a sports team. Every adult who's engaging with young people in any kind of leadership facet has the ability to say like this is going to be a space that sets itself apart from your norms of what like cyberbullying and like and locker room talk. Like we're going to create something together, and an adult has tons of, I guess, like potential in making that, like you said, like a brave space, of safe space, and something that dignifies those young people and the relationships they want. And um and it's something that like young people do with each other on a one-on-one basis. They do with each other with like in small groups and friendships and that kind of thing. But I think that the possibility of a mentor and the possibility of um, a really intentional, um, guide or adult who's putting work in that and offering leadership in that, I think has the ability to make a, or has the capacity or potential to make a huge impact.
I love the fact that you threw down that you're a young educator. Um, I think the choice to spend time mentoring kids in whatever fashion, it kind of falls into a scope of being an educator. There was someone else I was talking to on the podcast here one time, and I asked him flat out. I said, you you strike me as well, I kind of made a statement. I said, I said you're a pretty amazing educator, and how do you feel about having that label? And it wasn't that he didn't embrace it. It was just in his words, he doesn't consider himself one. Um,
Huh.
you've declared, so you got the label already. But I'm curious, yeah, right? I don't have to sort of offer it to you. I love the fact that you've taken it, but I am curious. The what brought you to sort of this work? I will say for myself, there was no educator in my future. There was no, like, I didn't, when I was in high school, there wasn't a sense like that I wanted to work with kids or that I wanted to be a teacher. I, in some ways, kind of fell into it and have now sort of developed my developed my passion while I'm in the environment. It wasn't on the horizon for me. Um,
Hmm.
so for you coming into this work, being in schools, working with kids, how did you how did you come to this work, working with kids, let's say, but also with the angle of of sort of promoting positive masculinity within young men? What connect the dots for me?
Well, in terms of becoming involved in education, I think that sort of just stems from the fact that I was a really excellent student, and school for me was like a place of achievement, of excellence, and I got a lot from classes, from teachers, from my own self-directed study. Like I just school was a place where um, I guess I did really well, and so even at a young age, I kind of had a feeling like I really like. I mean, I like working with young people. I also like being here, um, but I didn't. I would not really identify as a teacher, and that's because I have this particular interest in this particular passion and skill set and working with boys. And where that sort of began is really as myself as a young kid. I have a twin sister, and I had long hair, so I had like what were coded as like effeminate interests. I did ballet. I played with Barbies, and I wasn't really public about that stuff at school, but along with that, I had long hair. And at a super young age, and then continuing on for years, I faced tons of gender-based violence. Like I heard the word fag before I knew what a fag even was. I got called a girl. I got told to cut my hair. I got shoved around and hurt in different ways. And so even at like, I don't know if that would have been like age 10, that I was really starting to be like, this isn't fair, you know. um, I'm being told to be a specific way. I'm being told to not be myself, and it's not fair that I get hurt and I get name called, and it's just because of some random person's idea of what it means to be a boy that I don't belong to. And so at that age was just had this sense of injustice, and then as I grew older, had a growing interest in, okay, what are those norms, like what are these, like what are this, like what is gender, like what the heck have how did it result in me getting hurt in so many different ways. And then as I started researching that was in a historic, like in a Bachelor of Arts sort of history context at university, and then in terms of my degree in education, um, the more I started to research it, and then the more I started to work with boys, I was just like, this is critical, that there are literate, experienced, committed, um, sure, we'll say educators engaging with boys and sort of helping boys reflect and expanding those notions that constrained me so, um, I'll say violently when I was a kid. So it was just like a growing thing that like this is so important, and then it's been like a self fulfilling thing where I commit myself to it and I learn so much and I grow so much, and then I head back in and I do more. So it's just like a growing thing at this point in my life. Um, and yeah, it's funny. Like I identify definitely as a young educator, but I have a real sense that I found my life's purpose, which is kind of wild, at age 24 to be like, this is it, this is what I'm going to be doing. And this is where I think I belong. So that's a little bit about me. But it's definitely started with trauma and kind of ended with purpose.
And then the sort of the driver that brought you into podcasting, was that just a natural kind of transition? Was it brought to your attention? Did you kind of seek it out? What tripped that space to go from, this sort of growing sense of, I need to be an advocate. Okay, I want to speak to this. I'm cool with who I know I have to speak to. And then there's opportunities. So in some ways, you could be a teacher. I mean, there's other sort of
Yeah.
venues. You could be working in, boys girls club. You could be sort of going into social work or other sort of therapeutic kind of work. How did the option of podcasting pop up? And was it something that you went at right away? Did you like, yeah, I'm going to totally do that? What were your thoughts around when the idea kind of started percolating?
The idea started percolating when I was a couple years ago. I bicycled across the country doing a multimedia journalism project that was 15,000 kilometers on a bicycle for Canada's 150th anniversary. And so I started listening. I'd never listened to podcasts before, but that was where I started because you can't listen to that much music while
That's
bicycling. So I
awesome.
started
That's actually
to
totally makes
delve.
sense.
Yeah, I started to delve into podcasts and was like, this is a really cool medium. And there's really interesting people having interesting conversations. But I went looking for stuff about masculinity and found a really limited um, set of options. Not that they were low quality options, but just that there wasn't many people talking about it. And there was nobody really talking specifically about boys or engaging or uplifting boys' voices. And so it was just this empty space that I was like, I think this is really important. That if we're talking about masculinity, we engage the young people who um, really are going to be, either challenging or perpetuating the culture that they've been given. I think it's really important that we start talking about how are we raising our young people, educating our young people, and then to have the opportunity to like actually listen to, uh, a young teenager. Like like that's just kind of mind blowing. And the first time that like I think it was Malcolm Gladwell. There's some sort of revisionist history like podcast. I think it's called Revisionist History or something like that. And he was talking about the education system, maybe in California, and he actually did have I think a 13 or a 14-year-old talking, and I was like, not transfixed, but I was like, that's so interesting to hear an actual young person talking about what they're experiencing and what they believe, and that. So that was like a bit of a catalyst as well. Um, and then in terms of like why not, like I don't know, for me like I've done a lot of reading on gender. I'm considering doing graduate studies, and so I think I have this. Now I'm like tooting my own horn, but I have the like I have a confluence of like on the ground experience as well as like academic, more I don't know if you call like intellectual understandings of gender. So I think that's a really valuable thing to bring together. And the hope with the podcast is that people can learn from boys themselves, like just hear boys' voices and be transformed by them, but also get a taste of some of the research and the connections that I'm able to make because of where I've gone with the masculinity stuff.
Toot toot, go ahead. That totally made
Yeah.
totally made sense. No, it's funny because I feel a very small parallel. I haven't done the cross Canada thing, but that experiencing a medium and having it kind of, actually I'll back up a second. Me having questions just in general around education is sort of, it's similar in some ways to you having this sense of inquiry around elements of boyhood. Like there's these questions that I just feel either the market or the media are not, I can't find it. I'm going to keep looking, but I feel like it's kind of missing. So then we lead into voice. high school perspective, we just call it student voice. I mean, anywhere else you would just say, the voice of, just include the voices of the individuals that you're, don't change them, let them change things with their voice. And that was one of the things I really appreciated with, I still appreciate now with your podcast, is including the kids' voices in there, them speaking to their experiences, and that it raises the not only engagement, but I think it raises, there's an element of intentionality around there, is that we're going to spend time in the emotional state of these boys,
Right.
because we're not talking about it. We're letting them speak to it. And it completely changes the tone, and also I think how we feel about podcasts. Because if you can hear, I mean, it's great to hear stories. And there's going to be people listening to our conversation like, yeah, I understand those stories. I liked their personal stories. The next, you can draw in some of that primary voice, though, of who the stories are about, not just the two guests. It's riveting. And if you had 1,500 kilometers to be riveted, I can only imagine some of the close calls you might have had on the bike, where you kind of get, preoccupied or fascinated by one of those ideas. Because that is one of the risks of me listening to a podcast when I'm driving. Like, I have to almost turn it off every once in a while, just so I'm keeping an eye on the road, right? So when you're out on the bike and you're starting to sort of formulate some of these questions about, or not questions, or just maybe intentions around what you're going to do, how you're going to kind of get into these conversations, did you have any, I shall do this two things. What was the stuff that you thought, like, just the really cool, positive, upside stuff that you thought, I want to fill part of my conversations with this. I want people to know, or at least to be able to hear, like, some of the coolness of being a boy. Was there anything on that list that you thought, this is just not what's being talked about?
I don't know if it fits quite the describer of coolness, but definitely like a bit of emotional um vulnerability. Like, often what boys are talking about on my podcast is stuff that you would not normally connect with boys' experience. Like, I think it was my second episode, was this boy talking about losing his best friend. And it's like, when you think about, like, when the average person thinks about boys' friendships, like, what do they think about? Like Fortnite, or Lego, and not heartbreak. So that sort of sense of emotional depth was something that I really wanted. The showcase is not the right word, but I really wanted to acknowledge and demonstrate, and allow boys to acknowledge and demonstrate themselves. I know, because of my relationships with boys and the work that I've done, that boys do have incredible emotional capacity and depth, but it's not something that's necessarily always part of mainstream perceptions about boys. Um, so I think that's part of um, that was part of the vision and the imagination of, like, what would it mean, like, to allow boys to talk about their own lives, and that, with that kind of depth and authenticity.
What about some of the thought traps? So the spaces that you thought were already, it's kind of being covered, but you thought, what, I gotta come at this one differently. Like, I need to kind of open up some light on this a little bit. Were there any of those topics or approaches that yeah, I just call them thought traps, where the conversation just goes there way too quickly, and we can land there, but we're gonna bounce off that pretty quick.
Yeah, back then, that was 2017, and back then toxic masculinity was not as talked about in the media as it is today. So at this point today, I would definitely say that toxic masculinity is a bit of a thought trap, and just in the way that it sort of polarizes people and doesn't, engage in super thoughtful or reflective discussion. Back then, and it's not like it was that far, it was 2 years ago, right? But back then, something that I guess, like, I consciously wanted to um, challenge um, was that people were always talking about men a little bit. And so long before I even really knew what the podcast would be called, or what exactly it would look like, I did have that idea of what I would say in that introduction episode, where I think it's like the very first thing I say in the entire podcast is, like, how do you stop a guy? Like, how do you stop a man from enacting violence? And I think I might have borrowed this format from somebody else, but I said, well, I basically talk to him when he's a boy, you know? And I kind of just distracted myself by like remembering what that was like. But basically, this narrative of like, how do you,
It's-
yeah, exactly.
Good thing you're not
But
riding
how
a
do you
bike right
stop
now.
violence at an adult level? Like talk to kids. And I think that's not, I would never claim that to be my own original thought. There's people that have suggested that for hundreds of years. But the way that people were talking about, anything from sexual violence to gun violence to, I don't know, like parenting, that they're often talking about men and not talking about kids, and not talking about boys becoming young men. So that was a thought trap that I was like, it's really important, that we talk about boys and we talk with boys.
That's a good one because it even you've got me thinking. So even the school that I'm at, the club is called Boys to Men, and I'm not about to go back and talk to my buddy and say, "Hey, have you considered rebranding this?" Just so we, let's stay with them. Do we have to sort of necessarily build that next level as much? Can we just stay where they are? We're with the boys. It's building the boys. That's interesting, and that's the truth. I'm going to agree with you. It's a truth. I'm not. I can't argue that at all. I want to go back to the toxic masculinity and the the language change up, because in that session that I was with you folks, there was the suggestion, the intention to move from toxic masculinity to precarious masculinity,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
and I brought that back to a couple people, and it didn't stick with them. They wanted to hang on to the other, and I thought, I won't say in a expressive way, but it just didn't capture, I guess, what their perception was in a way that toxic masculinity does. And without even, we didn't have a lot of time to unpack what their strands, what they were feeding into toxic masculinity. I think it was just because the way that it's branded in media, and it could be even, I think it's been jargonized by some of our professional development. I had not come across precariousness in relation to masculinity in any of my school PD.
Right.
So I'm curious about your experience in sort of moving the language into that space, and what new thinking has maybe kind of come out of it by being able to speak to it in that way as opposed to its toxicity.
Yeah. So like I kind of mentioned, like what kind of sucks about the term toxic masculinity is that it has a really polarizing response. As some people are really for it, and some people find that it kind of demonizes or vilifies boys and men, and you end up with backlash. Like not all boys are like that, not all men are like that, and there's this sort of, and there's different understanding. Basically, I'm kind of rambling, but basically everybody has an opinion on it, and some of those opinions are really strong and don't lead to really thoughtful understandings or discussions about, yeah, about boys or young men. And what I like about precarious masculinity, which is basically, I mean, the terms kind of suggest that it basically what it's getting at is that masculinity, or masculine status is not a given. And often in comparison to femininity and your identity as a woman, that's just something that you, I can't speak about girls as effectively as I can about boys. So I'll go back to boys and say that, like, but you have to prove yourself, right? You have to prove that you're man enough. You have to prove that you're tough enough, and that you can handle enough and that you can dominate in different ways. And so that there's this really sense that as a boy, as a young man, you've got to prove that, and your masculinity can constantly be called into question. You have to be ready to prove it again and again and again. And what I like about precarious masculinity is that it allows for that proof to be positive or harmful. It's not assuming toxicity, and it doesn't even in the like in its own term. It doesn't necessarily engender negativity towards masculinity. Basically, it's saying that there's a precariousness, and you've got to prove yourself. But you could prove that you're a man by taking care of your little brother, maybe. You could prove that you're a man, or that you're masculine by really excelling at a sport, or some sort of athletic, you know, thing. But you might also prove it by groping a girl, and you
Mm-hmm.
might also prove it by calling that kid homophobic slurs. And so there's a choice there, and there's agency there, and so I maybe in the next couple of decades, we don't get to the point where, that masculinity is still precarious, but we can shift the balance between how I prove myself as a man being from really harmful things that we're seeing, with 1 in 3 women in Canada experiencing sexual violence, and 1 in 6 men also experience sexual violence, with 99% of the perpetrators being men. Like, we can shift that balance towards, okay, let's prove ourselves by making choices that positively, impact ourselves, that positively impact the people around us and the communities that we're part of. So that's what I like about precarious masculinity, is that it doesn't, um, it refers to, I guess what I like about it is that it refers to all boys' experiences of masculinity, rather than just trying to single out, toxicity within an entire gender that leads to this backlash and leads to, confusion and different understandings of what that really looks like. That was kind of, I don't know if that was a long, it was sort of like a winding explanation, but I think it's a great term. I mean, it's hard to figure out jargon and when to use what and what people are going to resonate with. So, yeah, but those are some thoughts.
No, I think part of the motion towards moving, kind of like moving between terms, is that it's not as simple as we're just not going to use this new term. There's a brand new lens to deal with, right? And um I think that there's a automatic tendency to believe that it becomes zero sum, that there's no to sort of suggest that we can change the term. It's not that we're forgetting what the elements of toxic masculinity are. We're still working through that. But the 2.0 of this is for those of, okay, so if we effectively help a child deal with their toxic masculinity,
Right.
then what? So the kid, this is in, again, way I'm thinking about it. Okay, so if we're saying that we've stopped the kid from consuming, using, expressing whatever toxic elements of their masculinity that are perceived. So then what? Now we have an opportunity. The child has an opportunity. It strikes me like we need to have language that sort of picks them up from that space and says, here's now what we're going to help you to understand. I haven't come across, your explanation is on point, because I think it speaks to the necessary grind or work that has to happen in moving between those two terms. Because I do believe that there are adults that want to hold on to that, the toxic term, for I'm going to say for probably negative reasons. Like, they're just, because we need to have accountability. We need to there has to be sort of law enforcement, and there has to be punitive measures that keep that stuff capped. But what about the restorative approach, which some of the spaces that I've taught in, I've always been a little bit outside regular classroom. So I've been guidance, special education. I've worked in suspension and expulsion program. So I've always been in a space where, despite the fact that someone may say, cool, you're working with those kids, and those kids are kind of, let's say, pushed to just slightly outside of regular programming, I ask myself, well, what's restorative about being here? So once we do the work of sort of getting to a space where the kid can sort of access a different
Huh.
version of themselves, then what? So that's why I loved the switch in the term, because it struck me as, this is how you think.
Yeah.
This is next level thinking. So it didn't, on one hand, I heard your sort of like, oh, like your response to me saying that the teachers had a hard time embracing it. I think but no, I think there's part of it is, I think there's reason for it. There's big reason for it. And it was, when I go away and I come back and I have conversations and I come back and I share, part of it is there could be a whole weekend of learning that I've gone through,
Yeah.
and I can't express that in over coffee as I'm standing there. So I'll just kind of give some of the information. So there's still work for me to do to bring this language into common jargon, and let's really work through it, what it means within a high school context. But initially, in the 3 conversations I had about it just after the event, there was some short-sightedness there. People couldn't see how to get from one to the other, and so that's I guess my work in my context. But I really appreciate your explanation. Makes sense, because that is part of the grind in the movement between two terms. One term right now that is a complete flag in the ground, media saturated, and not really
Mhm.
losing steam.
I think the connection
Toxic masculinity.
Yeah, the connection to restorative justice, I think, is really apt. That had not occurred to me. That like perhaps part of the value of a term like precarious masculinity is that it leaves open the possibility of restorative justice. And toxic masculinity kind of doesn't. Kind of like the response, like how do you, I don't know. I'm kind of just speaking like I don't really know what I'm talking about at this point, but like okay, anyways. But toxic, like what is the response to toxic masculinity? Kind of like you said, like punishment, and containing that. But precarious masculinity means that you can recognize the culture that boys live within and walk into that with your eyes wide open, and help boys walk into that with their eyes open, knowing what's around them, but also knowing how they can make choices that, like I said, that positively impact themselves and other people. So I think the connection to restorative justice is really cool, and that hadn't occurred to me.
Cool. Happy to share, man. Happy to share.
Yeah, and I've like read about.
I got one more for you.
Okay, go ahead for it.
No, you drop in. You drop in.
I was just gonna say really quickly. I read an article that, or I don't remember where this was. That I wish I could remember. I need to go back and. Oh no, it was a chapter of a book that I do have an intention to reread. That was Raising Emotionally Healthy. I'm looking up on my bookshelf. Raising Emotionally Healthy Boys by Michael Reist. And one of his chapters is about restorative justice within basically, I think, like within sexual violence. But talking, I don't know. I need to reread it, but it was about the huge potential restorative justice has for changing. I don't know what to change the game, to change the playing field, to change everything, in terms of. Now, see, I'm just getting repetitive, but in terms of changing our justice system.
If I put it to the high school experience, it is that 5 minute. If toxic masculinity is the 5 minute noticing of what is not right, like I said, we need the longer discussion. So if restorative justice, one of the elements of it, and I've been involved with peer mediation and restorative conversations in high schools, one of the biggest challenges with it is time. That the big clock that says here's the beginning of the day and here's the end of the day and here's the beginning of the semester and the end of the semester, the beginning of the year and the end of the year, and all this stuff has to happen within this one school year. That sets a whole lot of that's a simulcast to a whole bunch of other timers, including that little 5 to 7 minute transition time between classes. As in, I just left here, I have to be there, and anything that happens in between, we need these quick kind of tools to be able to deal with. Now, you might be able to throw water on it to kind of put out the fire, but if you're not paying attention to what else is kind of like impacting and kind of sparking up around it, like nothing has helped in that moment. It stopped or paused, but nothing has helped. So I think that's the next space, right? That's the big challenge, at least from the high school is, and we talked about it, the brave spaces and the belonging. So getting a group of individuals together that are willing to kind of, individual singles you mentioned as well, you can make that one connection, that's cool too, but getting into the kind of day, the opportunity to move from these completely unmediated, highly social, and developmentally, let's say, challenges in the hallways into a space where some of that noise is pulled away and we can bring it back to, what is it that you're thinking now about this? What were you thinking when it was going on? How do you feel about this? How might you feel in the future? How did you feel even before this thing happened? So I think that's always been the restorative challenge, and having any of the individuals involved in the relationship or whatever just happened being dignified enough to be able to speak.
Yeah, one quick thing about that is, again, a different book that I've read, looking at Cracking the Boy Code by Adam Cox, where he one of the things that he says is that boys have sometimes have, what was the term? Idiosyncratic behavior. And I actually, now that I say it out loud, I'm not 100%. Maybe you can tell me exactly what that word. Anyway, so idiosyncratic behavior, that they might do something wrong, but for really good reasons. And those reasons might be related to their emotional vulnerability. So he's talking about engaging boys who have made a mistake, but kind of like you said, with, like dignity or uh, awareness, of what emotions might be going on in that context.
It's a truth. It's a total truth. Here's my here's my next question for you. Here, it's the kind of, let's say this is the wrap up question. You cool with a wrap up question?
Sure, totally.
Oh, all right. And it kind of goes from the next. That's the point of view. The next. So, what's coming down the pipe? What are you working on? What are you kind of excited about as you move into the summer? What are some of the, and I mean, speak from the personal, speak from the professional. What's the next thing for Jonathon?
Well, I'm literally going to turn off the microphone with you and then go and finish my own podcast episode, which is long overdue. Um, but I'm super excited. I just did a really sort of incredibly vulnerable conversation with an adult who is sort of anyway. It's yeah, I mean, you'll have to wait to see. But I have this really incredible intersectional episode coming that's about sexuality and about culture that I learned a lot from. And but I've been as you can probably empathize with, like, I've just been so busy, trying to create a podcast on the side is not easy. So I've been putting it off just because have felt a little I don't know if intimidated by it or overwhelmed by it. But I'm going to turn this off with you and then go open up my own software and get cracking on it. And that'll because I'm headed to summer camp tomorrow, which is a very engrossing full-time job. So I'm hoping to finish it tonight. So that's on the very, very, rapidly approaching horizon. I'm going to go crush that, do some more recording and editing. And then I'm going to call that'll be the end of season 1. So in the fall, I'm intending to come back to podcasting, and I'm intending to do it with a little more, maybe with a little more rigor and a little more, timeliness in terms of scheduling it and having it more cleanly laid out for myself. It's all a learning process and a practicing process. So, but just doing my best in that respect. So I'm looking forward to finishing this episode and I'm looking forward to setting things into motion for the next season. And in between this is my 6th year at this summer camp, my 3rd year being the head counselor for the 10 to 15-year-old boys. And it's a place that I have a huge sense of belonging, huge sense of connection, and also a lot of, I guess, like, the privilege of a lot of responsibility to be coordinating and facilitating a lot of masculinity stuff that has a huge impact on the young men who are also help making me lead it, and also the boys and teenagers that are part of it as well. So a really cool day and a really cool few months ahead of me. And it's just where I'm at in my life, just like huge passion, ability, and opportunity. So if I sound really excited, it's because I am.
Rightfully so. I look forward to your whatever comes out for your second season, and I definitely you've got me intrigued with this next episode, the teaser that you threw down. Where do you want to be? It's the truth. It's the truth. I'm good with that. Like, it was a good teaser, and the stuff coming down. The rigor part, I'll say flat out, side hustles are difficult. It is difficult to kind of
Yeah.
track passion and professionalism at the same time. If you can put them both together, I don't know if it becomes any easier, but if it's a side hustle, it takes some pretty strong intention to sort of bring it back to the table. And as far as let's say your episode that you're putting together, if any part of that last episode of season 1, any part of this episode you're talking about, if any of the pause is because of the kind of the nature of the content or the conversation that happened, or just maybe the intensity of it, I've been there, and I get that. I've had conversations where I'm like, oh, okay, when I release this, what will the conversations be? How will I feel? Like, it's almost like going back to my first episode and my finger hovering over the publish button, and like, what am I about to do? What am I about to do right now? Where would you like to be found? Someone wants to reach out, connect with you, continue the conversation, check out some of your posts and content. Where could they go?
We'll say Breaking the Boy Code. So if you Google Breaking the Boy Code, breakingtheboycode.com, or @boypodcast on social media, you can connect with me. I am really active on Twitter, and I just like I'm also at a point in my life where I like cannot get enough of people engaging, sharing, their stories, sharing their engagement with boys. Like, I think it's really critical that um, this sort of inchoate group of people that are passionate about boys and also passionate about gender equity, that we communicate with each other and support each other, and support the boys and that we're working with. I don't know if that really made sense, but basically, like, so at Boy Podcast on social media and let's get connected. I think it's really important that we do. Yeah.
No, that totally makes sense. That totally makes sense. I appreciate you. Thank you for spending some time with me. Have a blast at camp. Like, seriously, have a blast at camp. Uh, and I look forward to whenever you and I can connect again. Seriously, whether it's digital
Yeah.
or at another session, another training session with NGM, I'm down with that, man.
Yeah. Thank you for your time. And I'm sure you're going to go off and spend some time with your kids today. So all the best. Send some love.
Oh, dude, I can hear yeah, thanks, man. I can hear them smashing around upstairs. So that's the whole thing. It's the interesting thing about, if the mic got a little hot, it's because I'm leaning in. I'm like, oh, they totally hear the bass from upstairs. Just my kids running through the kitchen or something. So yeah, it's family stuff today. So I appreciate that.
Okay. Well, all the best then. Thanks again for your time. It's been awesome. I've learned stuff. I've realized stuff. So it's just wicked to be part of these kinds of conversations. So thank you.
Agreed. Cheers, man.